So Mary Ellen and Stacy asked us to do this and to talk about the Trump agenda for, or what the Trump agenda would mean for financial services regulation and what Dodd-Frank repeal meant. And my first thought was, I haven't the foggiest idea what Dodd-Frank repeal meant. And I mean, I guess it's a funny morning to be thinking about that because I also had no idea what Obamacare repeal meant, and it turned out they didn't either. And so there's a certain amount of trying to sort of work back from the slogan to figure out what the constellation of things are that they are somehow, that are signaled by this idea of Dodd-Frank repeal, either to the electorate or that are meant by the folks who are advocating for this thing. So the first question I thought is, well, what is Dodd-Frank? I mean, what is the thing, the political thing that they're reacting to? And Dodd-Frank was omnibus legislation adopted in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, which was basically aimed at avoiding having the same thing happen again. It didn't punish the wrongdoers. From the left, it's been criticized for not punishing the wrongdoers. But the basic idea was to look at gaps in the existing regulatory structure pre-2008 and see if we could fill them, come up with either regulations or administrative structures that would prevent an economic free fall like we had in 2008. Now, to put it in some context, because you're all younger than Jim and me, something like this happens after every single financial market crisis, right? If you go back before Dodd-Frank, there was Sarbanes-Oxley. Before Sarbanes-Oxley, there was, what was the one before Sarbanes-Oxley?
Sarbanes-Oxley.
Sarbanes-Oxley.
No,
yeah, there was one before that, right? And in the middle, there was Graham-Leach-Bliley.
FIREA and all that.
Yeah, FIREA, that's it. It was FIREA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and Dodd-Frank. And in the middle, there's usually a deregulatory move. There was Garn St. Germain, then there was Graham-Leach-Bliley. So there is a certain sort of familiarity to the regulatory swinging of the pendulum. But the 2008 financial collapse was big, and so Dodd-Frank turns out to be big, right? I sort of went to Wikipedia and said, well, what are all the chapters of Dodd-Frank that we're talking about? And I thought I'd go through them, and that's when I thought there were 10, and it turns out there are 15. So I'm not even gonna try. But if you want me to send you the list, I can. But you don't have to. You can just go to Wikipedia. That's where I got it. So the question then is, which of the things that were done in Dodd-Frank have turned into negative, let's call it Republican, because this is a part of the Republican agenda, talking points. One is this idea of no bailouts. The second is that the Dodd-Frank bill had somehow imposed or put in place a variety or constellation of regulations that placed excessive limit on, call it what you will, risk-taking, job creation, entrepreneurial activity, innovation, I don't know, things that it basically, Dodd-Frank does say you can't do some stuff, so people were upset about that. And then the other thing that it did was it created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has its own sort of constellation of reasons that people either think it's really awesome or really bad. So that's sort of the historical context of it. And the way we're going to do this, I think, is to sort of take those basic talking points, and Jim and I are going to ping-pong them back and forth. I'm going to start by getting rid of the no bailouts idea. That's actually a pre-Dodd-Frank Republican talking point that actually is in Dodd-Frank. It's actually really quite stupid, but it's in there, so don't worry about that one. The second is this idea of excessive limits on risk-taking, which, and we're going to talk about these in reverse order. One on the banking side, on the bank resolution side, is a set of living wills and capital requirements that are designed to require ex ante banks and systemically important financial institutions to manage their affairs such that if they suffer a business shock, it won't trigger a global financial collapse. The Volcker rule, the fiduciary rule, and so on, which Jim will describe, are financial services regulation designed to protect investors, but also to protect the structure of the securities market. And then the third one is the CFPB. So we're going to flip it, because the CFPB is sort of off by itself, and I'm going to explain it, and then I'll sit down. Okay? So what is the CFPB? If you think back to the financial crisis, the financial crisis grew bizarrely out of a crisis in the subprime mortgage lending market. In other words, the trigger was a collapse in the market and an increase in the default rate on mortgages on houses that were sold to poor people. Right? You don't usually think of the idea of mortgages on houses sold to poor people as having the kind of, how should I say it, systemic importance to trigger a global financial collapse, and quite frankly, all by themselves, they would not. So if you start with the idea that this started with a problem in the consumer financial services market, the question is, one piece of this is, what do you do to protect the structure of mortgage finance? But the other piece is, a lot of people lost their houses, and a lot of people got into these mortgages and unsustainable mortgages in ways that were the result of bad behavior by people at the marketing or the supply side of mortgages. And perhaps we ought to create an institution that would think carefully about consumer protection from the perspective of the safety and soundness of the financial system. Let's just sort of quickly look at the things that the CFPB has done. It's adopted what are called qualified mortgage rules, which impose certain limitations on what subprime mortgages can do, also on what terms they can have, and also sort of kind of impose a requirement that you determine the ability of the person to actually pay back the mortgage. It's kind of radical, but whatever. They've promulgated some payday lending rules, which deal with payday lending. They're actually pretty remarkably not great rules, but payday lending is a problem. But the other thing that's been happening is they've been doing a whole bunch because there's now an agency doing research on consumer financial practices. And so they've done a study on how consumer arbitration clauses are used. The finding turned out to be, they're used to make it so that people don't actually arbitrate. The number of arbitrations turns out to be vanishingly small. And then they've also got this consumer complaints and resolution database to actually track what happens when people complain about their mortgages and or try to restructure their mortgages and how those complaints get resolved. So there's now an agency that is actually looking over the shoulders of the people who are selling consumer financial products. You can see how that might be controversial. Not necessarily bad, but it's controversial. So why is it bad? Well, it was Elizabeth Warren's idea. That sort of makes it bad. The way they structured it, it was structured as within the Federal Reserve. This was done in order to protect its autonomy. It might or might not be constitutional, but it was a cool idea. Basically, the budget is wrapped into the Federal Reserve budget so that the legislature can't starve it without starving the Federal Reserve. And the director is an independent director with a term of years rather than someone who can be fired by the president. That's actually up on appeal to the D.C. Circuit right now. Trump might actually get to fire Richard Cordray at some point. So anyway, the reasons they don't like it is that it can't be controlled. And then, I don't know, because consumer protection is bad? I don't know. Okay. That's the CFPB. So part of Dodd-Frank repeal, come on, would be, where'd it go? To repeal Title 10 of Dodd-Frank and get rid of the CFPB. Okay, Jim, take it away.
Okay, well, we didn't really practice this.
Right.
So let me.
So Jim's going to say what he's going to say, which might or might not fit into my outline.
Well, yeah. Let me just say a few words about, because part of it is, we say Dodd-Frank, but then you also think of, well, what does the new administration, the Trump administration, mean financial regulation? And I don't know. My sense is, and I've said in my classes already that, it obviously wasn't a big part of his campaign. right? And it probably, if you asked him, I mean, would you tweet something, Donald? And he probably, just get rid of regulation or something. That's not the hot button issue that you all know about. And so I think when you're thinking about financial regulation and the Trump administration, you really have to look at, well, who are the people going into the administration? And I think and I think that's what Ted is bringing forward. You're really going back to, you're just having the Republicans who are familiar with financial regulation, that's not everybody, and who have interest in financial regulation, well, they're the people who are going into the administration. It seems to be just the old cast of characters coming in. It's just, you had the Democrats in, now you have the Republicans in with their concerns, and some of the concerns are the ones that you brought up, and certainly the CFPB is one of those. I mean, it's curious to me that a populist, I always thought, oh, you're a populist. And populist in my mind, I always think of Andrew Jackson, and doesn't he have like a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the White House? And populist, could
It's just
be
mean to immigrants.
What? Well, no, I mean, it could be potentially very interesting in one way, because the history of populism and financial regulation is a strong hostility to large financial institutions, which really characterized our country until like 30 years ago. We just didn't like large financial institutions, and we specifically kept them small. And so, when I thought, oh, you have a populist in the White House, maybe you may cut down on regulation, but you may be kind of hostile to large financial institutions and all, the ones we know about that were really the key firms that were problematic in the meltdown in 2008. And I think that there's a little bit of tension from what I could see in the administration with some of that populist, attitude. And so we're not sure who will prevail. I mean, I suspect the populists won't. But someone like Bannon, they say, oh, he was at Goldman, but he was just passing through Goldman. He's kind of a populist sort of character, whereas the other ones that Trump has appointed to financial positions are really more mainline financial people, all from Goldman and the big financial institutions. So I think that's key. I mean, it's only key insofar as to see you might get something interesting in financial regulation in a way that would be very different if the populists prevail. But I think for now, you kind of think, well, what's going to happen is the standard, Republican positions on financial regulation. And I mean, the way, and we're generally in agreement on this all the time, which is, what's the Republican positions versus the Democrat? I mean, to just put it very simply, I mean, I think that with the last administration, did a huge, I'm sorry, if you go back to this, and I think you highlight this huge response to Dodd-Frank, I mean, to the financial crisis. But a lot of it had nothing to do with the financial crisis. It was, well, let's just regulate everything else we always wanted to regulate, I think.
And actually, just to jump in here, if you actually look at the titles, each of the titles has its own name as the this, and this act. And the reason it has the this, and this act is that these were all bills that were kicking around in Congress for 5 years before as the Democratic Party wish list, and suddenly the train was running through the station.
Exactly, and if you look today at like how do you pronounce his name then? Hensarling's, the Freedom Act or whatever, the Republican plan for financial regulation, you kind of see certain things, dealing with the CFPB, but then you see that the Republican wish list. So, anytime when you have, a lot of this had nothing to do with the financial crisis, and so people are fighting about it, and sometimes, kind of from policy perspectives, with the one group saying, well, we need more regulation, and it's kind of the progressive vision that we trust in the regulators to work out the problems in the market, and the other group saying regulation's too heavy and we need to cut it down. And certainly Dodd-Frank has, produced a lot of regulation, and a lot of regulation that people said, well, that had nothing to do with the financial crisis. Why did you do it?
Yeah, and
because it was a wish list.
Right,
Yeah.
and let's I keep putting up the Volcker Rule. It's called the Volcker Rule, but if you sort of want to get the whole historical arc, the Volcker Rule is actually Glass-Steagall, which goes back to the 30s, which was then chipped away until the mid-90s with Graham Leach Bliley, and this is basically saying we're going to go back to a 1930s model of financial services regulation.
But
which is, by the way, not a bad idea. But
yeah, it may not be, and maybe we can talk about that at one point, but see, the whole trajectory in financial regulation has been very permissive, whether under Democratic regimes or, Republican regimes. The big kind of opening of financial regulation was done during the Clinton administration, Graham Leach Bliley, which created which kind of didn't create, but sanctioned the creation of the large financial institution, where you just have these big financial firms with banking and securities.
Okay, so just to jump in, what the Volcker Rule says is you can't have a investment bank and a commercial bank and an insurance company all being the same thing, right? That those have to be separated.
No. Volcker's just dealing with proprietary trading. It doesn't.
Well,
go
but
that, it just spins proprietary trading out of those institutions.
Okay, which is to say you can't trade for your own account.
You can't trade for your own account. And it also says you can't sponsor an investment fund, which is like a hedge fund doing the same thing. What happened?
Which used to be the difference between an investment bank and a commercial bank.
Yeah, even though they have propriety desks and commercial firms.
He knows about this stuff.
All I'm saying was this. When this was an Obama administration creation, and for certain radical people, they said exactly what Ted is saying. Let's go back. Let's go back to the way it used to be. Put banks in a particular world. And why? Because they're very central to the economy. It's things that everybody uses, and let's protect them. And then we have kind of wild finance over here. But the problem is we don't want wild finance to drag down the banks and then, result in government bailouts. And that was kind of a populist approach in the law for something like 60-some years until it was thrown out. Now, when we had the financial crisis, people pushed the Obama administration and said, go back to it. But they said, no, it'd be too complicated. The world has moved on. And this was the only little thing where they went back. But today now, there are voices in the Trump administration who are echoing that kind of approach, saying, well, let's put the banks in a particular world, let's put the investment banks and all the speculative finance in another world, and just, and then keep them separate, and that will avoid a lot of the problems. But in general, my overview is just this sense of, well, we were just saying kind of the Republican positions back again. Now, you're talking, and then we'll go back to you. You're talking about the CFPB. The other thing to know about it, and bank regulators, the federal bank regulators, their main focus is always on the solvency of banks. That's why they're very close to banks, but that's what they care about. The problem is that in the law, they were given a consumer protection mission as well in the banking law. And what I think came to the fore in the financial crisis was, on the mortgage stuff and everything else, is that they couldn't do the two missions. Their traditional mission was to safeguard the banks, make sure the banks didn't go down, safeguard the banking system, and they kind of gave less attention to the consumer protection mission. And less protection is actually...
That's generous.
That's generous.
Yeah, that's generous.
They oftentimes took a very anti-consumer position. And so...
Because the idea would be that if you made a bank loan officer liable for selling an unsuitable product to a consumer, that would be bad for the safety and soundness of the banks, and therefore it was actually contrary to the safety and soundness mission. So the two were actually in direct opposition.
They were
to
in
each other.
competition, and so we had a meltdown in 2008, and a lot of that, as well explained, kind of came from the ground up. It's not through some exotic product, but just from ordinary products. And so a lot of the reason for having this, which was Elizabeth Warren's idea, and she was a law professor before, wrote about it, wrote a book about it,
To be perfect, on Wednesday in March in 2008, I had lunch with Elizabeth and talked to her about this, and I told her it was a terrible idea.
This thing? Yeah, but from a banking point of view, if you look at it, you say, well, of course you needed it. Of course you needed some agency that in the banking world that would just care about consumers so that the agency could just focus on that. And I'm not even sure, the Republicans would disagree with that.
Yeah, no, the reason I said it was a terrible idea was that you were creating a one-stop agency that would then, within 5 years, be captured, not because it wasn't a necessary thing.
All agencies are captured.
Yeah, that's why I changed horses on this one.
But there's, the Republicans, in their legislative proposal don't say get rid of it, even though they're trying to have it do some other things which may take away its mission. And then there's this debate on its structure, and I think it was a Democratic mistake. They were trying to put it in, it was very unpopular, and then they thought, well, let's see a way to put it in and not have its budget be subject to Congress. But I think that raised constitutional questions, which they're now facing in court. But otherwise, I think that was a tremendous advance, and it was needed. And if you looked at banking, we didn't have it because the Federal Reserve, the Office of the Comptroller, the currency, all the other financial regulators arguably were not, that wasn't their main mission. They probably weren't doing a good job.
The other people who had jurisdiction over were the FTC, and they were mostly worried about, watered shrimp rather than financial
Here, you
services.
want to talk about something?
Yeah, so let me talk about something, a different piece of Dodd-Frank where there's almost no chance that repeal is going to come into play here. But there is going to be, in all likelihood, there will be significant changes as a result of the changeover to a Republican administration. Remember, this 2008 financial crisis involved a collapse of the financial system, right? And one of the place where the collapse happened, one of the things that was sort of a surprise to the universe, right, was you had a banking system that was regulated, right, by the FDIC. Banks, and I'm going to oversimplify here, banks do boring stuff. Banks are regulated. Banks are subject to capital rules. Banks move slowly. Then you had over here investment banks, which for regulatory purposes aren't banks, right? Or non-bank banks. These are the Lehmans, the Merrills, the Goldmans, right? They are investment banks, but they are not regulated financial institutions. And what happened in the, actually starting in way before, but really blew up after Clinton and then really blew up under Greenspan, was the way in which banks got around the financial capital requirements was to create a system called shadow banking, right? Where instead of lending money, they would create financial products, which would then in turn issue safe financial products, mortgage-backed securities, treasury-backed securities, all sorts of things which sort of existed in what are called securitization facilities, right? Which aren't banks, which aren't really anything, which aren't subject to regulation. But the cool thing about it is once the security is issued, it gets bought over here. And so a lot of the risk that that was over here, one, moved over here, and was basically, we moved from a bank-financed mortgage market to a capital markets financed mortgage market. Two, once these things are created, by the way, the banks can purchase it and use it as capital. So the thing got all messed up.
Maybe just, the risk was just the risk of having a long-term investment.
Right.
That's what banks do. They make long-term investments, particularly in the home market.
Right.
So you have this long-term investment, and now you say, what do we, that's risky because it's long-term.
Right.
And now you just make it into something else.
Now you make it into something else, and then you move, and they basically diffused the risk throughout the system
Yeah.
and pretended there was none of it for some complicated institutional reasons that I don't want to get into right now. So anyway, you ended up with an unstable banking system, and there was this realization that you had these things over here which were outside the regulatory scheme called systemically important financial institutions. Let's just say Lehman, okay? And they figured, okay, we need to come up with a way of making sure that that part of the economy doesn't tank the financial system again. And so Titles 1 and 2 of Dodd-Frank are designed to sort of deal with that. And the way they did it was, on the one hand, to expand the regulatory structure that covered banks to incorporate systemically important financial institutions. But second, also to expand what we'll call the resolution regime, which is to say the way you deal with failing banks for banks, over to cover these systemically important financial institutions as well. Now, putting aside the mechanics of that, which I'm kind of up to my eyeballs in, wearing other hats of mine, the basic thing that the re-regulation or the regulation of the SIFIs was that they were required by the FTC to create these things called living wills or resolution plans, which would basically explain, if one of your businesses tanks, how do you survive it? And if one of your business tanks in a way that affects the business, how are you going to resolve the firm in bankruptcy in a way that doesn't tank the economy? And so the banks, for really the last 7 years, have been going through this planning process called the living will process, where they're basically required to explain to the FDIC, this is what's going to happen if things go bad. And the basic thing that they have to do in order to show that is that they've got sufficient total loss absorbing capacity in the bank, which is another word for saying capital, which is to say another thing, which is liquid assets that can be devoted to operate as a shock absorber within the global firm, right? Let's just say, and there's a lot of window dressing around this, but that's basically what's going on. And what keeps happening, by the way, is the FDIC gets its living wills and they say this isn't okay. And then they send them back. And there's sort of been this pulling and tugging. I think they finally approved somebody's living will about a year ago. But basically, no one's willing to sign off on the fact that this bank is okay. There are a whole bunch of reasons why. But the big problem here, though, is if you have to maintain capital, you can't lend as much. And so that has led to, and I'm beginning to hear it in the things that get suggested to law professors when they say, wouldn't this be a good idea? As ways of making it so that, we don't have to park the capital up at the top. Maybe we can move it to an intermediate level facility that we can then move it around. And so it's somewhere at any given moment, but we don't have to worry about exactly where it is. And now they're upset about the fact that, we actually have to keep this capital in the middle level. Yeah.
Could I just,
Of course.
Remember,
He's the banking guy.
Just for the big point of view, because it ends up being a big, but again, it gets technical,
Right.
as you see. It's like, what you essentially, what you described very well, is that we now as I told you, we ended up with these giant financial institutions, which are still relatively small in respect to our gross domestic product overall, but they're still really big in relationship to what happened, let's say, 30 years ago. So now we have these giant financial institutions, and if one goes down, it really takes the economy down, as you saw. So now you're worried about that. And so as you're explaining, how do we prevent it? we'll have a living will and what have you. You know, if it goes down, then we'll know what to do. Even though that's kind of ludicrous, because if you've ever seen the structure of these large financial institutions, it just boggles the mind.
Right. Although, so let me just say that the living will process as a process has been incredibly constructive.
It's a good thing. It makes them think. It makes them set everything. But remember, essentially what the government wants. Just say that's the balance sheet of a big financial institution. Financial institutions all make money using other people's money. That's, you know, you put a little of your own money, you borrow everything else, you pay back the borrower something, and you keep all the profit for yourself.
And when we say a little bit of money, we're talking about 40 to 1 leverage, right?
Huge amounts. And so the whole point is...
And that's the business model.
Yeah, that's the model. Let's not put most of our money at. Let's use someone else's. So what Ted is saying, and a lot of what Dodd-Frank does is said, you know, you're so dangerous. And you're dangerous because all the stuff that's reflected over here and even off balance sheet goes downhill. So all this stuff goes downhill. If this all goes downhill, someone's got to, it starts to shrink. Someone's got to take the loss. And just say in a banking institution, these are all the creditors and the depositors, but behind them is the government. And the government says, well, if the loss comes, we don't, that means the taxpayers. So they say to the banks, have a lot of your own money in there. It doesn't increase.
This is the no bailout state.
Yeah, this doesn't decrease the amount of loans. That's the old red herring that the bankers always say. Well, the loans are over here. The capital has no effect on that. But what they say is, we don't want to put our money in. We want to use other people's money, because that increases our return. And what Dodd-Frank said, and then the regulators have enhanced it, they said, no, we want a lot of your capital and other loss absorbing. Right. Now this may be in the Trump, administration, when you see some of the bankers fighting back, saying, as things get better, we don't need so much capital.
Right. There are two stories that I've heard, in meetings with people, right? One is, wow, the banking system is now really well capitalized, right? That the world of 2017 is just so different from the Dodd-Frank, the 2008 world, that this is the positive story, that the world is in a good place, which of course that leads to, and so now we can be loosen up a little bit. The second one is, maybe we could substitute governance for capital, right? So that if we improved our SIFI governance rules, then maybe we wouldn't have to keep so much money tied up. We, by the way, are going to have a program on that in September next year, and I will try not to laugh when they say that, right? The other piece of the Dodd-Frank, it's a little bit of a shell game here, and this is actually a from the left critique of Dodd-Frank rather than a from the right critique of Dodd-Frank, is if you really look at, the capital rule part of it is real, but when push comes to shove, if there is another financial crisis, the likelihood that there would not in fact be a public bailout of the banking system is actually 0 to none. Right? And so a lot of what we're doing here is, on the one hand, the FDIC and the regulators basically pushing and saying, we're going to put a firewall between taxpayer money and government money. But there's also a certain amount of window dressing, because the statute is basically designed to make it almost impossible for there to be a public guarantee. But everybody in the conversation knows that, one, that guarantee is basically still there. Two, it's basically priced in.
Right.
And so there's a certain weirdness to the conversation with its being not about what it's actually about, because no one is really talking about the fact that at the end of the day we're talking about regulating on behalf of taxpayers.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. I think that's I did.
We'd rather, yes.
Why is that so? I mean, couldn't one that everybody knows there will be another bailout. Could what's happened and the fury at there not having been
Yeah, so
punishment
this
at Wall Street to say the next time there won't be a bailout?
Oh, is it?
And so that would change
Well, so
that's not what people think, but for the outsider.
No, for this is the politics of it, right? The outsider perspective is, it is a rational political view to say, we bailed out Wall Street, therefore we shouldn't do that again. Jim and I think, are probably both captured by the view that at the end of the day, the bailout of the financial services industry, and quite frankly, the automobile companies, as ugly as it kind of was on balance an appropriate move by the government at the time. And that it,
I agree with that too,
yeah.
but I don't think that
But-
has forecastability.
No.
At the political level.
Well, I think when you have such, I mean, put it this way, we still, our large financial institutions have only gotten larger. Those are the ones we were worried about,
Right.
you know. If one of them goes down, you know, that's equal now to like 10 to 15% of GDP. It's just, and it's going to pull down the other ones. I mean, it's just inevitable that you'd have the government. I don't care what the law says.
Yeah, no,
They'll
this is
change
we're both
the
agreed
law.
on that.
They'll change the law in a
Right,
day.
right.
And
Yeah.
neither
Neither of us are particularly troubled by the fact that it says no bailout, because the hydraulic reality of that kind of a crisis will take care of itself, just as it did in 2008.
Yeah, it just happens, you know. It wasn't on the books in 2008
either.
either.
But aren't you suggesting that there are grown-ups in charge?
Yeah, you know, there are grown-ups in
There
charge,
are
and I
actually.
think they all.
There actually are grown-ups in charge of the banks.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
I
I think that's right. And all this stuff is, you know, they say, well, what's the best
wanna talk about the deep
what
state?
can we do to prevent that from happening again? So Dodd-Frank was one response. Another response, which the Obama administration hasn't taken up, but it's still like floating around, is, well, let's break them up so that when one goes down, it's not so big. Or keep them away from the commercial banking system so that if they go down, even so that may
Right.
still pose problems. But you see, these are just, let's not get to the point of having to bail out. And so, and I think that was a lot of this was a valid effort at it. Yeah?
In terms of investor protection, can you talk briefly about the fiduciary rule and also what the dismantling of the CFPB would mean for the Jobs Act?
Okay, well, CFPB has like nothing to do with the Jobs Act.
But wasn't it also that there was a lot of back and forth about non-accredited investor protection?
Okay, well, look, no, I mean, look, and this isn't really it wasn't so much part of Dodd-Frank. I mean, we were going to talk about this. Another side of things is, I mean, you had fiduciary rule up there,
Yeah, I
right?
did, yeah.
Okay, I mean, the fiduciary rule was.
because they actually did something to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it came through the Labor Department.
Right.
It was something in Dodd-Frank that said to the SEC, you could do something with this. And
Wasn't it conflict of interest?
what?
Wasn't it conflict of interest or about disclosures?
No, it's essentially this. They say broker-dealers, when they deal with you, they have fiduciary duties, but they're kind of one-time fiduciary duties. Like if they recommend something to you, they have a fiduciary duty to recommend an appropriate product. People try to make fun of that, but they're wrong, okay? I mean, they're just wrong. It's actually quite a strong duty, the suitability duty, as it's been amended, today. Investment advisors have a duty just to look over your portfolio, so it's not a one-time thing. So you have these two duties, and they said consumers don't understand the difference. Like you go to a broker, and the broker's called, what's the broker called? A financial advisor. And you go, well, I guess they're an investment advisor. No, they're a broker. They don't have the full duties. And so in Dodd-Frank, people have been saying for years, let's harmonize the duty. Harmonize the duty. So they said to the SEC, you can do it. The SEC has kind of kicked it around for the last 8 years, not really, put out things and hasn't really moved forward on it. And then the Obama Labor Department, not through anything to do with Dodd-Frank, said, we're going to do it with respect to retirement assets. So that if you deal with an individual, and this isn't covered
So glad
by...
he knows the answer to this question,
What?
because I have no clue. Yeah.
Yeah, no. If the ERISA, under that's administered by the Department of Labor, that has fiduciary duties in it, but it's only when someone administers a plan. Like someone's a trustee for a plan, but it doesn't have duties with respect to individual retirement accounts. Well, the Labor Department comes up with this rule and says, hey, retirement stuff is important because that's how today for us, we all depend upon our own retirement assets. And they say if you deal with a retirement assets, if you as a financial professional, if you deal with them and a consumer, you're under a fiduciary duty like a strong one. And that was much kind of criticized by the brokerage community, and also kind of the financial community in general said, well, what's the Labor Department doing it? And the Labor Department said, we're doing it because the SEC isn't doing it, and we think retirement assets are important. This rule was promulgated by the Department of Labor, but its enforcement date was supposed to be this spring. And it had nothing to do with Dodd-Frank. And then the Trump administration comes in and says, okay, maybe we're not going to enforce it. Or now we're going to stall its enactment. And so that's kind of the fiduciary rule. I mean, the reality is that things are becoming harmonized, but in a way, the SEC and Dodd-Frank said to the SEC, you can do it. You don't have to do it, but you can do it. But they didn't do it. And because of maybe fighting in the industry about what you should do. So that was that one. So what was the other one?
It was the local rule and the fiduciary rule, the two that I actually put up as bullet points.
Okay, yeah.
So let me just jump in
please,
on the point that illustrates that Jim and I had agreed we were going to get to at the back end of this, which is, on some level, Dodd-Frank repeal. Who cares about Dodd-Frank repeal, right?
It won't happen.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
What we may see some targeted legislative action aimed at particular pieces of Dodd-Frank, but probably more fundamentally important here is what I'll call the general opposites day approach to executive functioning that the Trump administration has been following, which is you can still put someone in charge of the SEC, or if you can fire Rich Cordray, the CFPB, or the Department of Labor, who doesn't really care about this stuff, right? And so a lot of this is going to end up happening through rulemaking processes and enforcement exercises of enforcement discretion that are just going to change in ways that matter the business environment it will, in a general hydraulic way, it will make business people who are engaged in risky behavior not worry so much about follow-on government regulation.
And what we should say, to be fair,
Right.
it will also allow business people who for the past 8 years have been deluged by regulations, not all of which, frankly, make sense, and have been deluged by an enforcement climate that's probably too aggressive, and so...
I'll stand over here while he says that.
If you talk to people, look, we've benefited from it, and certainly I like it because, I teach compliance. A lot of you are going into compliance. That's what gave us the job, because all these compliance is just making sure organizations comply with the rules. The more rules, the better from the compliance point of view. But I think if you talk
we're on tape, Jim, right?
Yeah. Well, if you talk to we're professors, we can say pretty much anything.
Yeah, right.
If you talk to people, even in compliance, they say it's just too much. It's too much. So the pendulum, as you said from the outset, probably should swing back.
Oh, I did not say should. Did not say should.
But you don't want it to swing to the point where you say, well, no, now it's going to the point of, as you described, where then people say, well, I can do anything. It kind of makes you nervous when you see, all the CEOs of the top financial institutions say, oh yeah, now we're welcome into the White House. They want to hear our views. Of course we want to hear your views, but we don't want to return to the time where they feel, well, they can do anything, So, there should be like a hand, at arm's length relationship. So that's your concern, is like then the pendulum goes, too far, I think.
Yeah, I think, look, if you look at, I'm standing over here and he's standing over there.
I'm left.
What?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's, I guess what I was going to say is we both come at this from what we think of as within the business regulatory discussion, a center-left perspective,
right,
where we're basically asking the question, markets are regulated, systemic risk is real, there is a government role in dealing with risk issues, consumer protection, and other things. Government is not perfect, markets are not perfect, and the question then becomes how does one do these things better and worse, and that there's going to be a constant pulling and tugging and balancing. What is frustrating, quite frankly, for both of us, even from the left, is the conversation tends to go on in caricatures, right? In other words, Jim and I would like nothing more than to spend, really, and to be able to charge for it, lots of time talking about the details of how to make these things work better, right? But instead, what ends up happening is it all gets capsulized, into talking points, which really have relatively little to do with anything, and then become, quite frankly, battering rams for people who just want people to leave them alone.
Right.
And so there's sort of this binary nature to the conversation, which ends up frustrating those of us who would like to see it be taken seriously.
But I think, and I don't know if you have any more questions, but I'm more, because I think these are all technical areas. So unless so I suspect it will just be arguments about the technical regulation, and it will drift in a particular way, but I don't see, this is a very complicated law. How are you going to get rid of it? It's not going to just disappear.
Yeah, so here's how, it won't just disappear, but so let me sort of take a slight issue with it's all very technical. One of the things that I view as our job, and quite frankly you should view as your job, is this is stuff that is very technical, but the motivating regulatory instincts or the concerns that motivate these things are not complicated.
Right.
It's very difficult, and this is both a strength and a weakness of financial services regulation, to be able to take something that is complicated and sophisticated and aimed at a policy goal and explain in a politically salient way and in a responsible way how to either fix it or improve it. And so part of our job is to sort of not just, I get very frustrated when I hear, and I know you didn't mean it this way, you say, oh, it's very technical.
No, but that's a good point, and I think the best example is just this capital thing.
Right.
Because you hear all the time, oh, it's too expensive to run a financial institution. Having us add more capital is so expensive. And it's going to cut down on loans. You even said it.
I know.
See, you say that's absurd. It has nothing to do with loans. It has nothing. The loans are over here. The capital's here. They say, oh, but the capital.
It has to do with their return on investment.
Yeah, they say we want to make a lot of money. If we don't have much invested, if I have $5 invested and I get $100 in return, it's better than if I have $10 invested and I get $100 in return.
By 100%.
Yeah, by 100%. So I want less invested in it, and I want, that's how we work in finance. We use people's money, and this is one of the great ones that you see it all the time. They have high capital requirements, they're too high, they're cutting down on loans, they're making everything more expensive, and you go, what are you talking about? It just means you want a higher return. You people, and you're right. And Jim
is right. They fooled me on that one because I hadn't really thought about how that actually plays out on the balance sheet, and Jim is absolutely right.
Right. Well, it's not me. It's really a professor at Stanford who writes about this all the time. And one of her book is called The Emperor's
Is
New
this
Clothes.
Lynn Stout, or-
You know, Ann Mati.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, and they just say, well, wait a minute. Once you listen to a lot of the things, and it's your point, a lot of the things that financial people say, and say, well, that's like this. And you go, no, it isn't. That's wrong. And, you know, so that's a good point. Your technical point is right. And all of us could understand it. I'm just saying that it's going to get a lot of it, people will debate about these things. So it's true, you have to bring it out to the public conversation.
And by the way, the fact that these things these are complicated. And we're talking about very large numbers. And we're talking about very large stakes associated with relatively small shifts here and there. So it's not like you should just be, this is an area where change is a little bit scary, right? And you do want people to, measure twice and cut once so you do want there to be a conversation about the technical detail before you actually move forward.
Right. Well, we have to
Yeah.
bring it to an end, right? These people have to go to class, I have to teach, but I don't know if anybody has a last question or anything, or, no?
So is it fair to say that your predictions at the moment, knowing less than perfect information and not too long in the Trump administration, is that the major thing we're going to see is change in enforcement, and that will have a lot of policies, a lot of implications and change in the world of financial regulation?
Well, it's also in regulation too, whether you propose regulations, maybe you're going to propose fewer regulations, it's also going to be on that.
Yeah,
This labor rule is a good example. It's about to go in force, then you say, delay it.
And that's something that can be done
know.
unilaterally through the executive.
Yeah,
Right?
and that-
I think, so my prediction would be everything we see today points towards continued legislative gridlock on anything.
On a lot of
On a lot
things,
of
yeah.
things. Some of this stuff is so below the radar that it might actually slip through with the right.
Well, the one thing that everybody will agree on,
Right.
and it's happened during Obama's years, is everybody will be in favor of capital formation.
Right.
I mean, you had the Jobs Act you meant,
Yeah.
that was during,
Right. There
you
are
just had
things
the
that will-
FAST Act last year, which
Right.
also, you're going to have more laws that say, make it easier for companies to raise money. And it'll be like 99, in the Senate, it'll be 100 to 0.
Right.
Everybody will
And
vote for
by
it.
the way, what's behind the curtain is going to be utterly non-transparent.
Yeah.
Right? But basically the answer is going to be for the next 4 years, we're going to have a Republican administration that, putting aside the peculiarities of Trumpism, is going to look like a Republican
Yes,
administration.
that's what I thought.
Great, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.